You're listening to the Mezzo Guild podcast.
بس أنا لازم أحسه الأول عشان أقوله.
아직 나의 어색한 한국말이 짤따рат하고 지적하지 말아주세요.
Я хочу с тобой серьезно поговорить.
Really good news, Farragut. No, I can quit this Maldives a year short.
Language learning, made simple. Hey everyone. I jumped back into serious Greek study about 2 weeks ago. As I mentioned recently, I've committed myself to learning modern Greek to conversational fluency this year, but at the same time reviving and mastering Koine Greek, New Testament Greek. Now, if you don't know what Koine Greek is, it's an ancient ancestor from about 300 BC to 300 AD, an ancestor to modern Greek. And it's a language that I've already spent about 4 years on in college, but I never quite completed it. So it's always been this thing that's kind of bugged me that I kind of left it unfinished. So I'm happy to get back into this. This past 2 weeks that I've been working on it, it's really been an eye-opener for me as to how much I truly remember, and also how much I've forgotten. As I've said in the past, if you learn a language properly the first time, then you never really forget it. This is why I believe that if you learned a language in school but you can't remember it, it means that you never really learned it in the first place. I can already see those aspects of Koine Greek that are etched into my memory forever. I just remember them. And then there are other parts that I must not have learned properly, as I've completely forgotten about them now. I feel like I'm seeing them for the first time. Today, I've been reflecting on my initial struggles with Greek way back in college, and also the common points of confusion that my peers had when starting the language as well. I'm going to share some of that with you. One of my main goals with this project is to identify the points where New Testament Greek is a major struggle, to look at how it's commonly taught, and to see if there's a way to radically improve it. Now, I've been reflecting on something for a long time. And that is, what is wrong with the way that most colleges and resources teach Koine Greek? I've been poring over really highly respected Greek textbooks like The Elements of New Testament Greek by Wenham, by Duff and Wenham, and The Basics of Biblical Greek by William Mounts. And these books go into great detail on all the fundamental aspects of Koine grammar. But as I look at them, I keep asking myself, how could this be better taught? How could it be better taught? I've actually seen a whole class fail Greek. When you hear terms like optative mood, second aorist middle, periphrastic tenses, it's really enough to make you drop out of Greek. It's enough to make you give up. But the reality is that learning these things is, unfortunately, it's unavoidable and it's necessary. And this is especially true with Koine Greek because an incorrect verb tense translation can have enormous theological ramifications. Now, in English, if you think of the difference between something like I have stolen money and I stole money, it's not just a small grammatical difference. Saying I stole money sounds a lot more serious and recent. It's like a confession of something you've just done. Look, I stole money. If you say I have stolen money, on the other hand, it could have happened years ago and you could just be recalling it as a past experience. So likewise in Greek, when you're translating Koine Greek, we can't escape the fact that the grammar is truly important to learn. But the question in my mind is when and how. It's at this point that I really want to present a challenge to every New Testament Greek student and teacher as well. And that is, I think that the way that Koine is traditionally taught is backward. And it's a lot more tedious than it needs to be. With modern languages, we don't start off by learning how to become a translator like we do with ancient languages like Koine. Now imagine walking into your first French lesson and being handed a curriculum for advanced French translation on day 1, and having the teacher say something like, by week 12 of this term, we'll be translating the philosophy of Jacques Derrida. And that's essentially what we do with New Testament Greek courses. We expect students to go from zero knowledge of the language to translating deep, abstract theological concepts in the New Testament within a very few short months of study. The more I think about it, the more I realize just how completely unrealistic this is. You certainly wouldn't see this in any modern language course anymore. And as I've said before, in order to become a translator, you need to first know a language. It doesn't happen the other way around. New Testament Greek classes today don't teach the language as a once living natural language. Instead, classes are kind of like code breaking sessions where you learn the appropriate rules and then you proceed to crack the text. It's almost expected that you'll forever rely on a lexicon, grammar tables, and commentaries in order to use Greek. In other words, never actually learn the language. You learn the alphabet, some core vocabulary, and enough familiarity to navigate a lexicon. But imagine being able to pick up a Greek New Testament and read a Pauline letter fluently. Read a letter fluently and actually hear the human who wrote this. Hear and get a feel for the human creativity behind all the little nuances, the words, the expressions that the author used. But how does someone learn a dead language as if it's still alive? How do we avoid treating Koine Greek like it's a code-breaking exercise? Now, if you've followed me for a long time, then you're probably familiar with how I approach modern languages. Over the past few years of running my blog, I've been able to achieve conversational fluency in languages like Russian, Korean, and Irish, with virtually no grammar study. Languages with a reputation for having hard grammar. And I achieved this through a method that I call chunking, which I developed on the back of Michael Lewis's lexical approach, which is an English as a second language methodology. Now, I stand by my belief that you do not need to study grammar in order to learn to speak a foreign language, and I'm living walking proof that this is accurate. To sum up how this works very briefly, languages are not just a system of rules to be memorized. Languages work as a kind of like a stack of building blocks. What we do is we take words, collocations, phrases, and sentences that we've heard countless times throughout our lives, and we piece them together like blocks. Almost everything we say in our first language is completely unoriginal. You may think the sentences that you're speaking are original, that you've just made them up, but in fact, all you're doing is you're borrowing from what you've already heard before or read. You've encountered it all before. When you speak, you're actually piecing together chunks of language that you've heard thousands of times throughout your life. Those chunks become so totally familiar to us that we speak them without even thinking about it. It becomes a habit. That's why it's so easy for a native speaker to spot a non-native speaker too, apart from the accent. As native speakers, we've learned to plug the right pieces into the right places according to what we've heard countless times, whereas a non-native speaker attempts to put pieces where they don't fit based on their assumptions, because they haven't quite had the same length of exposure that we have. Or in the case of Koine Greek students, they try to align everything with the grammatical rules that they've learned, rules that are often broken in natural speech. So chunking is about letting go of the need to know how everything works at once, and instead just letting exposure and repetition do the work for us. I'm attempting to apply this to Koine Greek. So as I said before, knowing Koine Greek grammar well is unavoidable, and it's something that you'll gradually have to learn if you take theology seriously. Small nuances of meaning can have a major impact on what people believe. So I'm not suggesting that we abandon grammar or even suggesting that it's possible in the case of a language that's no longer spoken. The goal with what I'm doing is to work on acquiring proficiency through frequent exposure to high-frequency chunks, whether they be particular word forms, collocations, or phrases. Now take a listen to this. This is John 1, the first few verses of John 1.
Εν αρχή είναι ο Λόγος, και ο Λόγος είναι προς τον Θεόν, και Θεός είναι ο Λόγος. Ούτως είναι εν αρχή προς τον Θεόν, πάντα δι' αυτού εγένετο, και χωρίς αυτού εγένετο ουδέ εν ο γέγονεν. Εν αυτό ζωή είναι, και η ζωή είναι το φως των ανθρώπων.
So just listening to this first few lines of John chapter 1, you can identify some high-frequency patterns already. And these are some of the ones that I'm focused on, things like enarche, in the beginning, pros ton theon, with God, ton anthropon, of men, and then you have him with a few different constructions like diauto, through him, chorisauto, apart from him, and auto, in him. So you have these high frequency chunks that you start to see all throughout the text, but it goes much further than that too. It's not just about that. It's paying attention to frequent patterns of placement of words like ein, was, he was, and egeneto, to become, or to come into being. There's a predictable flow and pattern to the way that these things are spoken or written, where they're placed in sentences, how they're actually used. And it's the same reason why we say things like knives and forks in English and not forks and knives, because it all has to do with natural phonetic flow. It just feels better. It's a natural It has more of a natural flow to it. It feels more comfortable. And as I've said before, where I've talked about chunking, you might think that by analyzing things, just a small section like this is a waste of time. You might think, oh, isn't this just a waste of time memorizing a half a dozen lines of a passage? And the answer is no, because these few simple lines will enable you to recognize these patterns in a multitude of other instances, especially in a work by the same author. Now, this particular passage, I've listened to this. It's the modern Greek pronunciation of these lines literally hundreds of times in the last few days, to the point where I'm probably driving my wife crazy playing it on repeat. I'll continue to listen to this another 1,000 times until it rolls off my tongue like English does. Even though the pronunciation difference between Koine and modern Greek is undoubtedly very different, I'm using these native recordings daily for repetitive listening, and it also helps me to practice my modern Greek pronunciation, so it's kind of got a dual purpose there. Now, I should note that if you asked me what verb tense or declension so-and-so is, I probably couldn't name it for you at this stage. But I couldn't do it in English either. If you asked me a grammatical question about some of the English that I use, I wouldn't be able to answer that question either. So what I do is I look at a word or a construction and I say, I don't need to know why that is what it is yet. The rules behind that construction don't matter to me right now at this point in time. All I need to know is that X means Y. Treating the language as a living language, although dead, and hearing the author's voice as I read. And frequency is really key to this whole thing. High frequency, do it frequently. Now, I should just say that what you just heard is it's a modern Greek reading of the Koine text that I found on a website called vivlos.net. And when I clarify terms and input them into Learning with Text, I refer to a website called greekbible.com. I'll talk more about that soon. I'll be going into greater detail about this method soon on my blog, and it'll also be on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/mesoguild, I think it is. So if you're curious about effective grammar study methods for Koine Greek, I'll also be covering that soon on my blog, so make sure to head over there and subscribe.